Hello and welcome back. This is the week 5 lecture. So today we are talking about formalism. And this is the first critical school or approach that we're going to be tackling this semester. So we've already talked about this approach a little bit as sort of being the first critical approach to really take off in the US. And like I was saying last week, the rise of formalism, or what was called the new criticism, roughly 100 years ago, really helped usher in what we would think of as like modern literary study at the college level in this country. We didn't really do it in a consistent way until the new critics came along. So, in a lot of ways, they kind of started this tradition of literary criticism as we know it in this country. Not to say that they invented literary criticism, like we were saying last week. Criticism has existed as long as literature has existed, but the new critics kind of modernized it, and we still use a lot of their ideas today, as we're going to find out. So I would like you guys to try to do your best to work through chapter 3 in the book. I know the textbook chapters are a little bit challenging. That's why I'm summarizing a lot of the key ideas in these lectures, and I'm also providing the written lecture notes. So if you don't want to watch lecture, or if watching and listening isn't quite enough, you can also find the notes in written form. But I still want you guys to try to read the chapters, and honestly, if you want to sort of skim some of the instructional parts because you're getting a lot of that through lecture, that's fine. But what I would really like you to pay attention to, since we did read Frankenstein and since we did read To His Coy Mistress, take a look at the examples at the end of each chapter when they model that particular critical approach that they're talking about using those texts that we've mentioned, including Frankenstein and To His Coy Mistress. So that's the whole point, of reading those texts at the beginning of the semester, so we can appreciate these examples that we're getting in the book. So I'll point you to those at the end. If you want to sometimes jump ahead and really just focus on those examples that you're getting in the book, that's useful, even if you're not reading the chapters word for word. I am here to help with these concepts. So let's talk a little bit more about formalism, what it means, and why it matters to us. And I really want to bring up some debates that are still going on, some ongoing conversations that people in this field of study are having. And we can sort of think about it as like formalism versus reader response, or privileging the text versus privileging the reader. Like, there's some really interesting questions that I don't think we've fully resolved as an academic discipline. We're still kind of working these things out, and in many cases it's still a matter of personal opinion. So you might discover some of your own preferences and some of your own critical instincts as you're learning more, not just about formalism this week, but also about reader response theory, which kind of developed as a counterpoint to formalism. And you're going to see how we've really used a lot of techniques and methods from both of these approaches. We've taken some of the best parts of formalism, and we've taken some of the best parts of reader response to really construct like our modern way of conducting literary analysis and literary criticism. But let's start with formalism because it comes along first. Like I said last week, this critical approach is roughly 100 years old. It really sort of rose to prominence during the 1920s and 1930s. So it's been around for a while, and as the name suggests, formalism is a critical approach that primarily concerns itself with the form or the structure of literary texts. And as they point out in the book, it can be sort of difficult to define what we mean when we say form, when we're talking about literature. Form is a notoriously slippery concept to define and explain, but basically, just think of it as a structure or a framework, the actual shape that a text takes, the shape that we see it in when we read it on the page or on our computer screen. So let's talk a little bit more about that. And I really want to discuss form in three different senses, right? There are three different kinds of form that the formalists would have thought about. So if we can really cover all three, I think this will begin to make sense. So for starters, we can talk about external form. Now, this often refers to lyric poetry, short works of poetry, much like To His Coy Mistress. And as we're going to see, the formalists really liked to analyze lyric poetry. Lyric poetry as distinguished from what we might think of as longer, more narrative poems. Although a lot of lyric poems will have narratives that they're telling, but typically lyric poems are shorter and more focused on imagery and language than they are on, presenting a story. So this type of poetry was best suited for the formalist approach because there's always going to be an external form in a particular poem that we can identify. So if we're thinking about traditional poetry, there's a lot of different ways to think about form. There's a lot of different things that give structure and shape to a poem. And a lot of that stuff really comes down to providing patterns, right? Or structures that we can detect, we can identify as readers. So if we're looking at a sort of an old-timey poem, we can look for things like the meter. We can look for things like rhyme scheme or stanza organization. We can also look for other formal features of the text that will often show up as repeated patterns. So if you're looking at meter or rhyme scheme, you're going to be able to track those throughout an entire poem because, sometimes the rhyme scheme might change, sometimes the meter can change, but those are usually recurring patterns and you can detect them, track them, and analyze them. And if they change, if they shift at some point in the poem, well, you can notice that too, and that's probably significant. So that's another feature that you can analyze. It's the same with stuff like lines and stanzas. You can count up how many stanzas there are. You can determine how many lines are in each stanza. Again, with a lot of traditional poetry, you'll notice a lot of patterns like this because a lot of traditional poetry is what we call closed form poetry, which means a lot of it sort of had to abide by certain rules about rhyme scheme, meter, line length, or stanza. So, for example, a sonnet, that's a particular type of poem. And if you're talking about old-timey sonnets, like the Shakespearean sonnet, those poems had certain rules that they had to follow. They had to have a certain rhyme scheme. They were usually in a certain type of meter. They usually had a certain number of stanzas, right? So you can obviously detect the form of a sonnet just by looking at those types of formal features: meter, rhyme scheme, stanzas. You'll be able to sort of understand the external form, right? It's got to be 14 lines. It's got to be 3 stanzas. It's got to be iambic pentameter, and we're going to have a particular rhyme scheme throughout. Okay, so you can always analyze those formal features, and it's often very productive to do that. You can always talk about those types of structures, those aspects of form. Now, again, this works best for poetry because poetry has the most form. It has the most formal features. But you could find some of these same features in other types of literature. It doesn't always necessarily have to be poetry. Poetry is just a great way to look for that stuff. So that's really what we mean by external form. But as they say in the book, the new critics or the formalists weren't super interested in those aspects of external form unless they could make a connection between something like the rhyme scheme and the overall meaning or purpose of the text. But this is actually a move that literature students make all the time. So, like, if you're going to get interested in the rhyme scheme of a poem, or if you're looking at the different stanzas of a poem, fine, you can come up with observations, ideas about those things. But the formalist would say, ultimately, you have to make a connection between like rhyme scheme and meaning, or the rhyme scheme has to express some larger idea or experience that is central to the poem's overall point or meaning. So that's fine, though. We can do that, right? And we often do that. So you could be looking at the rhyme scheme not just to make random observations about it, but instead to show how the rhyme creates a certain pattern or a certain repetition of sound. And that sound could be very important. That sound could make us feel a particular way. And the way that we feel could connect back to the larger point or meaning of the poem. So we're just trying to tie everything together. We can look at those formal features that we see in external form, but the formalist would want us to do something significant with them. Not just, hey, here's the rhyme scheme, hey, there's 4 stanzas, but rather, why are those things significant? How is the rhyme scheme creating an effect, creating an experience, or creating a meaning that ties in with that theme or some of the larger ideas at work in the text? So, as long as we can do that, we can definitely consider external form. But, you know, we don't necessarily have to get deep into the weeds about, the differences between Spencerian stanzas, different types of metrical feet, iambs versus spondies, or the differences between a Shakespearean sonnet versus a Petrarchan sonnet. We don't have to be experts on that stuff. And also remember, if we ever need to know a little bit more about some of those forms, some of those specific external forms, we can always look them up. That information is always readily available to us. All right, but yeah, formalists would have considered some of that stuff, but that wasn't really their primary interest when it came to form. They were more interested in what we might call organic form. And this is kind of interesting to consider because the concept of organic form largely came from a couple of different famous writers. Edgar Allan Poe wrote about it in the 19th century. He was, of course, a well known American writer of fiction and criticism, but also the English Romantic poets like Percy Shelley and Wordsworth and Coleridge. They also talked about organic form. So we've mentioned Percy Shelley a little bit. We're not going to read him, but of course we know that he was the husband of Mary Shelley, and he died tragically pretty early in their marriage. But he was an influential poet. He didn't just write poetry, he also had theories about the composition of poetry and other kinds of literature. So did Poe. Poe had a whole theory of composition, like really talking about how we write this stuff. And Poe, along with those English Romantic poets, really talked about this concept of organic poem, this idea that any successful work of literature is going to create a single unitary effect. So, in other words, all these different elements that are working in a text, all of those traditional literary elements, all the aspects of external form that we just mentioned, all of those things add up. They all work together towards a common goal. They are all working together to create this single effect. And that's an effect that would take place with readers, right? But we're not really talking about readers yet. We're just talking about what the literature does, the effect that the literature creates. And this is something that can, of course, be experienced by readers. But as we'll notice, it's not until we get to reader response that we really start thinking more about readers. The formalist didn't think about readers very much at all. They were focused on the text itself. What is the text doing? And how is it achieving its organic form? So for Poe and the English romantics like Shelley, and for the formalists, they all believe that any successful literary text will take on a shape and a form that is proper to itself. So that kind of makes sense, right? If the text is working, then it has an organic shape. It has the right kind of shape. If it didn't have the right kind of shape or form, it would not be as successful. So this is one of the ways we can evaluate texts, thinking about the form, the shape that they take. And if it's an organic form, it just kind of happens naturally because all of the elements in the text are working together to create that desired effect that the author was going for, right? So the shape of the text will really create the experience of the text. So again, if we're looking at the rhyme scheme of a poem, we're mostly interested in what that rhyme scheme does. It creates a pattern or a melody, a certain rhythm that has significance because that experience is going to help us to ultimately grapple with the meaning. So that's how organic form works. Everything is working together, complementing each other. Everything is sort of functioning off of each other to create this unitary end result. So that's how something like rhyme scheme or a particular character, right, could all be a part of this larger whole. See, this really helps when you think about literary analysis this way, because some students will get lost in the trees, right? They'll sort of get lost in the observations and just cataloging things, and then they'll be like, "Well, I have all these observations, but how do they relate?" Well, the answer to that really lies in this concept of organic form. If you sort of accept this idea that everything in a text is working together, all the characters, all the words, right? All the different features and elements that we can track, they're all working together. So they're all related, even if they don't always seem related at first glance. This is a good way to think about analysis because you can talk about rhyme scheme, characters, imagery, settings, atmosphere, and then you can bring all of those elements together and show how they're creating this unitary sort of larger effect or purpose. So that can be useful to think about. And again, for them, the organic form is really the best way to appreciate a work of literature. Because, like I was saying last week, the formalists really believe that we should appreciate literature for what it is, not just for what it can tell us about other things. So remember when we were discussing the traditional approaches to literature last week, we talked about the historical approach, the biographical approach, the moral approach, all of these different ways of taking the meaning from a work of literature and letting it sort of educate us about some other academic field. So like we were saying, literature was considered valuable, but not so much for itself, but more as functioning as a vehicle. Like literature can explain things about history. Literature can tell us more about the biography of the author. Literature can help us learn morals and lessons that we can use in life. So there was value, but the value is always linked to what the literature could tell us about something else. And the formalists come along and say, no, these are works of art. So we don't have to really worry about all the stuff that's outside the text. We just want to focus on the text. We want to focus on the artistry, the technique that has gone into creating the text. And for them, that really led to a consideration of organic form. Like, think about it the way you might think about a painting, right? If you go to an art museum and you're looking at a famous painting, you're going to have a lot of different things to consider, right? You're obviously deciding if you like it. You're obviously deciding what it means, but you're also studying or at least thinking about technique. You might be thinking like, how did the artist do that? Like, what tools did the artist use? What were their particular strategies or methods that they used to create this work of art? That's how we've looked at visual art for a long time, right? But it took the new critics to kind of really formalize that kind of approach to literature, especially in the academic spaces in colleges. And it's like, hey, we don't really care what it says about history or biography. We just want to understand how the text works. And literary scholars still very much feel that way. We're still very invested in understanding the organic form of a text, how it works, how it achieves its goals. That's where a lot of our analysis takes place. So, organic form is important still to this day, still important to us. And then the third and final sort of part of form, or the third kind of aspect of form that I want you to think about, is generic form. So now we're talking about genres, right? So genres can help us understand the meaning of a particular text. And genre will often shape the text to a certain extent. We were sort of talking about this a little bit before at some point, I think. We were talking about, the horror genre, for example, a genre that most of us are familiar with, and we might say that Frankenstein is an example of a horror story, a narrative in that generic tradition. So we've all seen a horror movie, or we've all read something that was supposed to be spooky. So we know the basic genre conventions. Even if you're not a fan, even if you don't seek out horror, you know certain things about the genre. You know certain features that are commonly going to show up in the genre, right? So when we sit down to watch a horror movie, we have certain expectations, right? We're looking for certain things. So not only does the genre affect us, but if we think about the movie or the book itself, the genre is helping to shape those texts, right? Because the author or the director, if we're thinking about a movie, they are also familiar with the genre. They also know what audiences expect in a horror tale. So they're either going to give us what we expect, or they might surprise us. They might, throw us a curveball. But the understanding of genre is important for the creators of the literature and also the readers of the literature. So if we're looking at a sonnet, we have to know a little bit more about that particular genre of poetry because, like I was saying, that genre requires a certain external form and certain rules. So we're going to have to know what those rules are if we're going to understand a Shakespearean sonnet, right? It's the same with more modern genres. If we're thinking about, certain kinds of novels, a Bildungsroman or a modernist novel, we have to know what those genres mean. Like, what do those genres include? What are the features? What are the characteristics that we would expect to find in those genres? Just if we're thinking about horror or romantic comedy or action, some of the more common movie genres, right? There is some overlap between movies and books. A lot of the same genres are at work. But sometimes we can get more specialized literary genres. Like I've mentioned, the Bildungsroman. Like that's a big word for a particular kind of novel that we might just call a coming of age story. It's really just a story about a young person growing up and sort of entering adulthood. So that's a genre that most of us are familiar with. Maybe we've never heard the term Bildungsroman, but we know what a coming of age story is, right? So that's a certain genre that we see in movies, TV, but also, of course, literature. So that's just another thing to consider. If we can tell what type of genre a particular work of literature is in, well, we need to think more about that genre and the generic form that the piece is assuming based on that genre. Because again, certain genre conventions, certain genre characteristics will help to give shape and structure to the text. I mean, that's very true with poetry. Like, that's literally true with a sonnet or a sestina, these types of poems that have to be written a certain way. They have to have a certain external form. But it's also true with horror, right? There has to be some jumps. There has to be some scares. There has to be some suspense, maybe a monster, maybe something supernatural, right? Those are certain rules that also go along with horror movies. So just think about genre a little bit as well anytime you're coming to a new text. All right. So those are the levels of form that the formalists were very interested in. And that's where they conducted a lot of their analysis, particularly on the level of organic form. So again, they're looking for these kinds of structural relationships in language, in specific literary techniques and elements. They're looking for these structures and these relationships that will add up to a unified whole. And it was their belief that if a critic conducted good analysis and really broke down the text by looking at these specific features of language and literary technique, that they would arrive at the one true meaning of the text. So, this is part of their theory that we don't really accept anymore. They were somewhat snobby, I would say. They were a little bit exclusionary when it came to the practice of interpreting literature. They believed that any great work of lit only had one true meaning, and a good analyst would arrive at that meaning if they were, patient and doing good work. So we largely reject that idea today. I mean, most professors would tell you that works of literature have multiple potential meanings. Now, they don't have unlimited potential meanings. There is such a thing as a bad reading or an incorrect interpretation. Those can happen. Like some people take it to an extreme and think, oh, well, there's no rules at all. You can just interpret it any way you want. No, there is sort of a range of acceptable interpretations, and we'll talk more about that when we get to reader response because they thought a lot more about that a little bit later on. But there is generally today, there will be a wide range of options. You don't just have to land on one right answer. So we've tended to reject that particular line of thinking, but we've accepted a lot of their other techniques. As they tell us in the book, this is a quote, reading well is what the new critics helped us learn to do. So you might be wondering, well, what does that mean, reading well? Well, we have this concept called close reading. And we still use it in lit classes. In fact, we're going to do a little bit of it in here in our critical responses and also in our big final paper. It's a pretty common practice in literature classes throughout the country, and it really does come from the new critics. So when you're doing a close reading, you're just really paying close attention to language, those formal features of the text, and you're not moving outside of the text. We're going to talk more about this in a minute, but when you close read, you don't really think about historical context that much. You don't get into the author's bio. You really just stick with what's on the page. And you're really supposed to focus on language and those narrative elements or certain poetic elements like we were discussing earlier. You're really digging deep into the specific features of the text. So a lot of us like close reading, both because it's just a productive thing to do. It's good practice if you're trying to become a better analyzer, but also it allows us to get away from the focus on theme and the focus on, well, what's the point? Like, let's just summarize the main ideas and move on, because that's so often what students want to do. That's easier, right? We can look up the theme. We can usually figure it out. If it's a famous text, we probably already know what the theme is. You guys don't have to read Hamlet to know some of the key themes in Hamlet. And if you don't know, you can Google it and you'll know in a matter of seconds. So as you can see, it's not that we can't talk about theme, we can, but when theme is all we want to talk about, you can see how that can be a dead end, right? It just doesn't give us a lot of room to analyze. Here's what it means. Here's what everybody kind of agrees that it means. And there's just not a lot of original work that you can do. But when you're close reading, yeah, you're going to eventually talk about the meaning. But first, you're going to talk about symbolism. You're going to talk about that word and that sentence and that metaphor. And if it's a poem, the rhyme scheme, the meter, that particular stanza, that particular line. You're going to get a lot more specific, a lot more granular. And that's what we want. That's why we still do close reading. It's almost an essential part of any successful literary analysis. It might not be all that you're doing. You can do other stuff, but you want to do at least some close reading so you can make good observations and come up with good ideas about specific features in the text. And see, that's what we sometimes struggle to do. We can talk about theme, we can talk about the main character because he's famous and everybody knows him, but we want to get more specific. What about that particular word that appears 3 times over the course of 2 pages? Let's talk about that. Let's just focus on that word for a minute. Maybe it's a symbol. Maybe it's important to the character. And eventually, if we're thinking about organic form, that symbol, that one word that we notice gets repeated several times, that's going to tie into the theme. So we can use our observations about that one word to help us eventually talk about theme, talk about larger meaning. But see, that's a better way to do it instead of just jumping right to theme and then being like, well, I'm done. Let's start with the specific individual features, put them all together because that's how organic form works, and we end up with an original interpretation that tackles meaning. So, in many ways, this basic process has been given to us by the new critics. We still like this practice of really tending closely to language and then using what we find to make larger conclusions about the meaning. But we no longer think like they do, where it's just one meaning and you have to land on that one meaning, otherwise, you're wrong. We've opened it up, we've made it more inclusive, but we still like close reading. I definitely like close reading, and I don't think you can do effective literary analysis without it. Some might disagree. I just think it's a core element to what we're doing. So we're going to be practicing it and eventually doing it in some of our bigger assignments. All right, so we don't have to get too much into the history of formalism. This is not stuff that I think is essential for you guys to know. You don't need to know the names and the dates, but it might just be helpful to have a general sense of where this school of criticism came from. So like I mentioned last week, for a long time, our primary ways of doing literary criticism revolved around historical, biographical, all these other disciplines. We would use these other academic disciplines to sort of extract the important meaning of a work of literature. But the formalists were really rejecting that. They were pushing back, especially against the historical and biographical models. They really hated those. They were like, we don't care about historical context. We don't care about the author's life either. The author isn't that important to us. What's important is the text. The readers are not that important to us. We know that readers exist. We need readers. We are readers. Readers are great, but we don't care about readers right now. We're talking about the text. And I do find that students can understand this. Like students can kind of relate perhaps to the frustration of formalists, right? But you guys are often on the other side of it, right? And you hear high school English teachers talk about this all the time. My students just want to talk about history. They just want to talk about the author's life, or they just want to talk about theme, because those are easier to talk about, right? And all of those things allow us to get outside of the text, right? If we can find some interesting historical context, oh, this story is set during World War II in Indonesia. Well, now I can go online and do some research about what was going on in Indonesia during World War II. And now when I'm talking about the short story, I can really just talk about the history, right? And I could make a few points about how the history connects to the novel or the short story, but mostly I'm just researching Indonesia in 1942. And I can find good sources on that. I read it, I understand it, and now I'm done, right? That's tempting. Or another classic approach, I want to read about the author. Let me learn more about the author. So instead of talking about their very boring novel, I can just talk about their slightly more interesting life. Okay, so we might sometimes want to do that, or we might take that moral or philosophical approach. That's another one of those old traditional approaches where, like I was saying, it's very much like children's lit, where you're extracting a lesson or a moral. Here's what we learn from the story. Here's the moral of the story. And you can put all your emphasis on that. Again, that's easier. It's not bad, but it doesn't usually result in great literary analysis. And that's what the formalists were pointing out. They were like, all these traditional approaches don't tell us very much about the literature itself. It tells us about history. It tells us about biography, about philosophy, or our morals. What about the poem? What about the technique that went into the poem? What about the novel? What about the strategies that the author used to write the novel? Right? They wanted to stick to the text, and we still think that's pretty valuable today. So again, they were called the new critics. It's kind of a funny thing to call them now, 100 years later, but they were sort of the first to really do this in a systematic way, and they helped usher in this kind of work to colleges and universities. A lot of these guys were college professors. So they mention a few of them in the book: John Crow Ransom, Robert Penn Warren. You might recognize his name. He was a pretty famous novelist and poet. He wrote All the King's Men, pretty famous novel, got turned into a movie later on. Alan Tate, Kenneth Brooks, these were some of the well known formalists who kind of helped to create, this particular school, and they were all practicing these techniques. I think it was All the President's Men. I can't remember the name of his novel now. It was either All the King's Men or All the President's Men. Look it up. Robert Penn Warren also wrote some good poetry. But a lot of these guys came out of Vanderbilt University, which is a pretty prestigious private school in Tennessee. But a lot of them went on to teach at other places. But they sort of spread the gospel of formalism, right? Talking about this kind of new way to approach literature. So they were believers in really taking a rigorous analytical approach to reading literary text. And again, we kind of take this for granted now because we talk about literary analysis all the time, but we didn't really have systematic, consistent analysis before these guys introduced it. And they insisted that everything we need in order to understand a text can be found inside the text. And I think this is an observation that's worth sticking with for a moment. Because again, this is often the opposite of what students think, right? We get assigned something for class, we read it, and we often immediately jump online to find summaries, maybe to ask some questions, to do some additional research, learn more about historical context, whatever, right? And there's good reasons for that a lot of the time, and sometimes that's justified, sometimes that's authorized, but it can be a little bit of a counterproductive instinct because we're immediately running away from the text. Oh, I'm not quite sure about that, let me look it up. I'm not quite sure about that, let me Google it, let me ask a chatbot, let me see what other people have said about it. And as a result, we never really grapple with the text ourselves. We're not wrestling with the language directly on our own. We're immediately going outside the text, largely to the internet. But even for the new critics, I mean, there was no internet back then, but they would have been like, yeah, don't consult other sources. Don't look up a book about the author. Don't go start reading about the history. Stay in the text. Stay in the poem. Stay in the short story. You never have to leave the text in order to understand the text. You just have to understand its overall organic form. which means, everything you need is right there on the page. So that can be daunting to a lot of students. They want the comfort of consulting other sources, and we generally still allow you to consult other sources, but it can be useful to spend some time just staying in the text because it forces you to be more observant. It forces you to notice things that you would not have noticed before, right? Even if you don't fully understand it, that's another thing that the formalists kind of taught us. You don't have to understand everything immediately. You're working through it. You are performing a rigorous, systematic analysis. Again, they would say this is similar to how a scientist would conduct their work, right? Just like a scientist might analyze like a genome or, some kind of other topic, or just like a mathematician might analyze an equation, we can analyze the text. We're not going to have all the answers right away, right? If we immediately had all the answers, we wouldn't need to analyze. We could just skip to the end, but we're going to work through it. We're going to solve the puzzle. We're going to figure it out. And we can do that on our own just using what's inside the text. I think that's a great way of approaching it. That's a great sort of mindset to have. And that's still something that we can follow today. So they really liked precision. They liked structural tightness and efficiency. They valued irony. And like I said before, they typically focused mostly on lyrical poetry, but they also tackled prose. They sort of preferred shorter texts because, like Poe, they argued that the best kind of organic form is really on display in a short text that can be enjoyed usually in a single sitting. So it's going to be easier for that unitary effect to really come across if you can just sit down and read the poem in like 10 minutes, or you can sit down and read the short story in a half an hour. So they favored shorter texts, but you could still use these methods really on anything. Some other things they like to look for, some stuff that we also should want to look for. Imagery. Remember, that's just language that can paint pictures in our minds, but we can go beyond just visual imagery. You should really think about imagery as any language that really taps into our five senses. And sight is just one of the five. We also have our sense of hearing, our sense of taste, our sense of smell, and our sense of touch. So you can always look for language that evokes any of those senses. Not literally. I mean, this language will not literally make you taste something or see something, but you're using your imagination, right? If it's good descriptive language, you're going to feel like you can see it. You're going to feel like you can smell it or hear it. And that's effective. That's something worth analyzing. They also liked metaphors. Metaphors are comparisons between two unlike things. So a classic example of figurative language. I tell students not to get too bogged down in all the definitions of different types of figurative language. It's just more important to kind of understand what figurative language is and how it's different than literal language. Right? So literal language is usually used to kind of refer to the here and now, our physical reality, tangible objects that we can hold and see. Right? So I can make really concrete, literal statements about my book, about my desk, about my glass of water right here, because this all exists in physical, tangible, literal reality. But we have another level that we often want to visit when we are writing literature or reading it, and that's the figurative level. So when we make figurative statements, we are not making literally true statements. We are not making factually true statements. Instead, we're trying to capture concepts. We're trying to capture more abstract concepts that might not have the same kind of flesh and blood physical existence. So if I'm talking about love or grief right? These are abstract concepts. I might find it useful to use figurative language to try to explain those concepts. We often turn to figurative language when we're trying to explain how we feel, or how a character feels, or what somebody thinks, because that's not always going to be strictly literal, right? If my friend is grieving, she's just recently lost someone very close to her, I could say that she is drowning in a sea of grief. See, that's a metaphor. I'm speaking figuratively. I'm comparing her process of grief to the experience of drowning in an ocean. Those are not the same thing, right? We are comparing two unlike things with a metaphor in order to make a larger point. So, my larger point here is that she feels like she's drowning. She's not literally drowning, she's grieving. But I'm trying to express what her state of mind is, how she feels. She might feel like she's suffocating, like she's not getting enough air, like she's trapped. That's not literally what's happening, that's figuratively what's happening. That's how she feels, right? Or a famous metaphor from Shakespeare: all the world's a stage, and all men and women merely players. Again, that's a metaphor. He's comparing regular life to a play. They're not the same. And he's comparing regular people to actors, right? Also not the same, but we understand his point. We often think of our lives like their narratives, like their plays. We're the main character, right? So we might think of ourselves as kind of the star of our own movie. But that's not literally true, of course. It's figuratively true. It captures how we feel. It captures a sort of a larger truth that can't quite be captured by literal truth. That's all figurative language is. So that's metaphors, right? Similes are also comparisons between unlike things. But even types of figurative language like hyperbole or personification, right? Like hyperbole is intentional exaggeration. Personification is when non human things have human attributes. But we're doing that, we're using those kinds of figurative language to make statements or to express truth that goes beyond literal truth. My cat's not really mad at me the way a person would be, but that's how I feel, right? So I'm going to personify my cat, give it human qualities because that's how I'm feeling. Right? I'm going to tell you that I'm tired of telling you something a million times because that's how I feel. Right? I haven't literally told you a million times. I've told you 5 times. But I'm trying to communicate that I'm frustrated with repeating myself. This is fiction, of course. I'm not really frustrated, but that's hyperbole, right? And we would use hyperbole there to make a point. I'm frustrated. I'm not making a literally true statement, but I'm expressing that I've told you multiple times, right? So get it right. So we always use figurative language to do stuff that maybe literal language can't do, to express greater truths, to express states of mind, how people feel, and also abstract concepts that aren't always described well just using literal language. So I just wanted to give you that definition quickly. But they like all kinds of figurative language, but they kind of classify them all as some form of metaphor. So they're mostly looking for metaphors. They're also very interested in symbolism. That's just when images or objects in a text take on a larger meaning and represent something larger beyond just their sort of literal existence, right? So we can always look for examples of symbolism. Lots of seemingly mundane, everyday items might have important symbolism in a text, but also ideas can have symbolism, right? Almost anything that we can observe could potentially function as a symbol, especially if it gets repeated, if it pops up multiple times, and if it seems really significant. So, anytime we can notice patterns in those sorts of features, we're in business, right? If we're noticing a recurring pattern of symbolism, all right, let's do something with that, right? This symbol keeps popping up. Why? What does it mean? Why does it matter? Let me do some more work with it. Or, hey, this is an interesting metaphor. Let's dig deeper into exactly what it means and let me figure out why it's important right here at this moment in the text, right? And of course, you can find imagery in any kind of literature, right? So you can always find these kinds of features and then you can start to analyze them, especially if you're seeing a pattern, if you're seeing them show up over and over again throughout a text. That means you've detected an important aspect of structure and form, right? So you need to explore it and connect it to all the other parts of form to try to explain that overall organic form. Maybe you can't cover every single aspect, but you can cover several. So those are just some things that we can look for when we are doing formalism, when we are conducting a formalist style literary analysis. Look for imagery, look for metaphors, look for symbols, look for any other features that seem to be creating a pattern or a structure. Now, they had a couple of don'ts. They had a lot of do's, things to look for, and then they had some don'ts, some things not to do. Again, we don't necessarily take them as 100% accurate on all of this, but we do still think about some of these things that they rejected. They had two fallacies that they talked about and that they really wanted readers to avoid. The first was what they called the intentional fallacy. And that's when readers don't separate a literary text from the intentions of the author. So, in other words, trying to figure out what the author really meant. If you guys have ever found yourself doing that, you'll know that this really paralyzes you when you're trying to conduct analysis. And I've had students even come to me and say, well, how can I be expected to know what Shakespeare's trying to do? Shakespeare's been dead for hundreds of years. And of course, that's true. You can't ask him. We're never going to know what a lot of these authors were actually intending. So, as a result, don't worry about it. That's what they would have said. Just don't worry about it. Who cares what the author intended? More often than not, the author's dead. Or if the author, by the time you're reading it, right, the author's probably dead. And if the author's not dead, it's not like you're going to meet the author, most likely. I mean, you're not really going to get a chance to sit down with the author and be like, tell me what you had in mind here. What were you going for? What were your intentions? So, because we're never really going to know, it's just not something that needs to factor in to our analysis, trying to decide, well, this is what the author really wanted. This is how the author wanted us to understand it. I mean, sometimes with living authors, they might do an interview where they'll kind of reveal their intentions, but a lot of writers of literature are pretty cagey about it. Like, they know it's important to let different readers interpret their work different ways. So they want, even if they do have a specific intention in mind, they don't usually share it with people. All right, that's something that they'll usually keep to themselves, and they'll let the public interpret it however the public wants to. So I agree with the formalists, and most of us still agree that you don't need to worry about authorial intention. You don't have to worry about what the author meant. We don't really care, right? It's more important for us to interpret the work. We don't need to worry so much about the author. Now, the other fallacy that they were really sort of uptight about, we don't have a problem with anymore. They had another fallacy that they called the affective fallacy, affective with an A. And this is when a reader judges a text based on its emotional effect on the reader. See, they really hated this. They thought that this was not scientific. This was not rigorous. This was not analytical. They were really looking to take emotion out of it. They didn't think emotion played any role in analyzing a work of literature. They wanted literary analysis to be objective. They wanted it to be more like the hard sciences. Like, we're just looking for the answers. We're not bringing our own personal opinions or our personal emotions into the mix. Nowadays, we largely think it's fine to consider emotion. We think it's fine to think about how a text affects you emotionally. That does matter. Because if it affects you that way, it probably affects other readers that way. So we can detect larger trends, uh, larger features that might be worth analyzing and talking about more. And like I've told you guys, the emotional response is the foundation for analysis. That's usually how we think now. You start with the emotional, and then you get more analytical. Yeah, it's true. You kind of move away from the purely emotional, right? You have that original emotional response. I liked it. I hated it. I love this character. That character makes me mad. I don't get this. I really like that scene. You start there. And then you start building a more rigorous analysis by looking at specific literary elements and features and coming up with ideas about them. But we don't have to reject emotion. We're not just relying on emotion, but it is part of our process. So we don't really have so much of a problem with the affective fallacy anymore. I don't even think it is a fallacy. Emotion's part of it. We are emotional creatures. But I would agree with the new critics. You don't have to worry about the author's intentions. We can think about the author, but we don't have to worry about their intentions. So again, like a lot of their stuff, we take the best stuff and we ditch the stuff that's a little bit outdated. And some of their ideas do feel outdated today. Other things to look for that they were very interested in, point of view when it comes to narrators. So when they were looking at like short stories or novels or even poems as well, they wanted to think about who was telling the story. Who's the narrator? Because as they talk about in the book, like the narrator has a lot to do with the shape and the form of a text, right? The type of narration we're getting, whether it's first person narration, like the main character telling their own story, versus maybe a third person omniscient narrator. Like those are very different narrative styles, very different kinds of narration. So as a result, they're going to create different forms that we have to navigate. So, point of view was very important to them, and they always wanted to consider narrators when possible. They thought if we weren't grappling with point of view, we weren't really going to understand the text. We had to understand what perspective or point of view the text is getting narrated from. Who is literally delivering that story? And then we have to think more about that narrator. And then finally, they really liked tension, irony, and paradox. So we're going to be talking about these three words a little bit more this week and next week. I just want to run through them quickly. It's okay if these feel a little weird and unfamiliar right now. I think we're going to get more comfortable with them as we move along. But for the formalist, tension was very important. All successful works of literature had some kind of tension. And it usually referred to opposites having some kind of clash, right? So it's either the interplay or the resolution of opposites. So again, that might not mean anything to you right now, but we're going to start looking for examples. And these opposites can be any number of different things. They could be characters that are on opposite sides of the law, or they could be images that seem to be doing like opposite things. They could be examples of language. They could be strictly narrative elements like setting, point of view, character. It could be almost anything. But we want to detect some source of tension, right? It's almost like some of that conflict that's going on in the story. But it's not always conflict between people. Sometimes it might be conflict between language or between ideas, personalities, perspectives. There can be lots of different sources of conflict and tension. But again, we're looking for opposites. How are these opposites interacting? Are they fighting? Are they in an oppositional relationship? Or do we find a resolution? Do we find some way to bring the opposites together? It's another thing we can look for in a literary text. They also loved irony. Another term that I find makes students nervous. Students often aren't really sure if they're able to identify irony. They're not sure if they understand irony. Let me give you the three most common types of irony so you can start looking for them. Let's not overcomplicate it. It's not a terribly difficult concept. So we can talk about situational irony. This is perhaps the most common type, or what most people mean when they say, oh, isn't that ironic? Situational irony is when the expected outcome of an event is the opposite of the actual outcome. So we are expecting one thing and we get almost the polar opposite. That is situational irony. And when that happens in a literary text, you need to pay attention. You need to make note, and that's something that you can definitely analyze. Another type of irony that we might detect is verbal irony. We all use this technique, even if you've never called it verbal irony. We've all used this. It's more commonly known as sarcasm. So, verbal irony is when the apparent or literal meaning of what we say is the opposite of what we actually mean. So we've all done this. If you are speaking sarcastically, you are using verbal irony. So for example, I might say, I love reading the textbook for this class. It's great. So the literal meaning of my sentence is one thing. But you can tell by listening to my tone, by watching my mannerisms, you know that my actual meaning is the opposite of what appears to be the literal meaning, right? The literal meaning is the opposite of what I'm actually communicating. So I'm saying that I love the textbook, but you can tell by my delivery that I really don't like the textbook. I'm actually expressing the opposite sentiment. I'm saying I like it, when in reality, what I mean is I hate it and I wish I didn't have to read it every week. So we all do this. We use sarcasm. I mean, not everybody's terribly sarcastic, but a lot of people are. And even if you're not sarcastic yourself, I'm sure you've met somebody who is. So even if you don't use verbal irony a lot yourself, you hear other people use it. You hear it on TV, you'll hear it with your friends, your family. And that's a nice reminder of really what irony is. It's when we're expecting one thing, or it's like literally one thing, but it's actually the opposite thing, right? It's similar with both situational and verbal. And then finally, we also have dramatic irony. That's when the audience knows more than the characters in a text. So we see this the most probably in plays, where maybe the character on stage doesn't know what we know. So that creates a kind of ironic situation in terms of us and the character. But we can also see it in other types of literature as well. So something has been revealed to readers or to viewers, but the characters don't know it, right? So we have more knowledge than them. So that's dramatic irony, which can also be analyzed and thought about more. And then finally, they loved paradox. What is a paradox? It is simply something that seems contradictory or even absurd, right? So this kind of goes back to the tension. They say a lot of literary works, there's stuff in them that at first might make it seem like the literary text isn't going to work, right? There's tension, there's a paradox, right? There's unanswered questions. Again, this is important to remember because this is often how we experience a work of literature. The first time we read something, we're often like, I don't think I got all of that. Like, you may have had this experience with Frankenstein or with To His Coy Mistress. Like, you always understand some of it after your first reading. You always have some sense of what's going on, but you don't know it all, right? You don't have it completely down. And so again, that might prompt you to look stuff up, to ask questions, to find additional info. I don't really have a problem with that most of the time, unless we're close reading. But you got to remember, there's nothing wrong with finding an apparent paradox. There's nothing wrong with being puzzled, being like, wait, what does that mean? Wait, how do we reconcile these opposites? Wait, what's going on here? I'm not sure yet. I don't have all the answers. That's okay. That's why we are analyzing. That's why we are digging deep into the text. So ultimately, we want to try to resolve the paradox. We want to make sense of it, right? Something that seems mystifying at first, through good analysis, we're going to find the solution, right? We're going to unlock it. We're going to unpack it. It's like a puzzle. We start out, it looks pretty hard, right? All these individual pieces, we don't know how they all fit together. We have questions, we have uncertainty, especially if you're not good at puzzles like me. But if you keep working, if you keep going, if you start figuring some parts out, eventually the whole thing comes together and you're going to have your answers. You're going to have your interpretation, but it's a process. So don't get frustrated by the opposites. Don't get frustrated by the irony, and don't get frustrated by the paradox. We're going to figure all of that stuff out. And it's always good material for analysis. So, if you want a good example of a formalist approach in action, turn to page 94 near the end of the chapter, and you'll see them working through that Wordsworth poem. So, look at how they locate tension, irony, and paradox in that text. Look at how they are exploring stuff like alliteration, metrical feet, the contrast between different stanzas, and all of these other specific details that we might not notice immediately. But if we're close reading, if we're really focusing on the text itself, not leaving the text, we're just focusing on what's there in the text, we're going to be able to talk about all of those things and start to arrive at an original interpretation. So that's what they're doing in the book. Now, you might look at that and say, wow, that is definitely not the kind of criticism I would like to do. That's fine. In the future, later in the semester, when we're working on the final paper, you can pick the critical approach that you want to use. You might not like formalism very much. You might prefer some of the later approaches that we learn about. But we need to try to master all of these, or at least get comfortable with all of these. So formalism is our first. You might like some of the others better, but you might find at least some of this stuff really useful. I hope you do. And now let's wrap up with reader response criticism. I know we've been talking for a while, so I'll try to keep this brief, but reader response really is the response to formalism, right? It's really the response to the kind of very rigid, somewhat like socially conservative style of the formalists. And again, I like a lot of what the formalists did. I still use a lot of their techniques, but nowadays we like to think about the reader. That's maybe one of the biggest ways that we are different now from the formalists. They didn't care about readers. They didn't care about authors. They didn't care about historical context. Like we said, they just wanted to stay inside the text. But reader response critics were like, wait, we can't really ignore the readers, can we? Because we don't have literature if we don't have readers, right? We can't talk about the meaning of literature unless we have readers trying to understand that meaning. So these were the critics that kind of brought the reader back into focus. They really said, look, we can still focus on the text while also thinking about the reader. So by the 1950s, critics and scholars were starting to move away from this strict, rigid formalism, and they started to think a little bit more about readers when analyzing texts. So again, they kind of reject the affective fallacy. They say, no, emotion's okay, and we should not ignore readers. But they kind of take it a step further in some cases and say, really, in a lot of ways, readers construct meaning. Readers kind of decide what a literary text means, right? So when they're summarizing reader response, that's one of the big points they make in the book. They say there's kind of two key points to remember here about reader response. Number one, we are prioritizing the reader and the effects on the reader. So again, formalists were interested in the effects created by a text, but they wouldn't take it to the next step and say, okay, now let's think about how those effects might go over on a reader. They weren't bringing the reader in. But now it's not just the effects, but how those effects work on readers, because that's who's being affected, right? When we say the effect of a text, we mean the effect on readers. So the reader response guys were like, we have to talk about readers, right? We really can't escape it. So they prioritize the reader, but also, as they point out in the book, they make the reader primary, and the text is now maybe a little bit more secondary. So in the book, they claim that a lot of reader response criticism kind of undermines the authority of the literary texts. Because unlike the formalist, we're not trying to find the one true meaning of the text. Now, and we pretty much believe this today, now we feel like readers get to determine the meaning. Readers get to say what a text means. Now, yeah, we're looking for some level of consensus, right? We would like maybe the majority of readers to agree on most of these key meanings, but there's room for disagreement. There's room, like I said before, for, a wide range of different interpretations. So we have adopted a lot of the reader response ideas. We like these. We like talking about readers. We're not ignoring readers anymore. So there were some interesting individual critics that they mention in the chapter. I won't get into all of them, but Wolfgang Iser is one that they mention in his sort of phenomenology. Phenomenology just means the nature of perception, how one perceives reality. So Iser and others were saying, look, a text isn't just an object that can be studied, right? Although it is that. It's also got to be studied through effect, right? And through how readers perceive the effects, right? The text might still be important when it comes to interpretation, but he was one of the first to really break with the formalist and say there's not just one meaning, right? It's really up to the readers and how they're perceiving what's happening in the text. And now we pretty much accept that as true in pretty much every literature class. But then there were some more ideas that we might think of as a little bit more radical. Like the one guy who says no texts can really exist without readers. Like there is no material existence of a text without readers there to read the text. And that's kind of debatable. And then this guy, Stanley Fish. I'm going to talk more about Fish next week when we have a little bit more time. But Fish came up with some really interesting reader response ideas, some of which he kind of backtracked on, others we still believe today. But he was big into, again, exploring effect, right? How texts affect readers, what he called affective stylistics. And he claimed that meaning is really negotiated and kind of discovered by readers. See, a lot of formalists and older generations of critics would say, like, the meaning is there, right? The meaning exists, and it's up to the critic or the scholar to find it, right? You have to find it. You have to do the right kind of analysis, and you'll end up finding that one true meaning. But Fish was like, no, that's totally off, right? We determine the meaning, but we're not just finding different meanings. We are constructing meaning. He gave the readers a much more active role. He said readers are negotiating and discovering the meaning. They are creating the meaning as they read. And that's a really fun concept, I think. I don't know if I believe it 100%, but it's very empowering for readers. And I think we should adopt that attitude, at least at times. But, and this is my final point for today, as they point out in the book, there can be limitations to the reader response method. Because if we're not careful, we might end up with like unlimited interpretations, right? We have to have some rules, we have to have some limits on how people can potentially read or understand a literary text. So that's where this idea of like the ideal reader comes from. I think they mentioned this in the book. I'm not sure if they really get into this concept, but it's important to the reader response school. And I'll try to keep this very brief and we can return to it maybe next week. But the idea is any author, when they're sitting down to work on their poem or their novel or their short story, they have an idea of their audience. They have sort of implied readers or ideal readers, the type of people that they can imagine reading their stuff. Right? So if I'm a novelist, I published a few novels already. I kind of know who my audience is, right? I know the type of people that are most likely to read my books. So even though I'm not directly communicating with them, and obviously they play no role in my writing process, they're not participating, they're not helping me write, but when I'm writing, I'm thinking about them, even if it's like subconscious, right? They're kind of in my mind, and certain decisions that I make, the ways I'm using genre, the way I'm using external form, my overall organic form, all of that's going to be influenced at least somewhat by what I imagine my readers to want and who I imagine my readers to be. I'm kind of writing for them. Now, maybe I want to surprise them. Maybe I want to be sort of sarcastic with them. And I'm going to say one thing, but I'm actually going to mean another. But no matter what my plan is, I'm thinking about my readers, right? So in the book, they kind of, I think this is a little bit of a problematic use of language, actually, but they talk about how we have to confine the available interpretations of a text to basically what they call what educated, sophisticated readers might think. I'm not sure if I really love that idea, but it is commonly used with reader response. This notion that, okay, yeah, there's a lot of different meanings, but we have to limit them to what those sort of specific types of readers that typically read literature would think. So in the book, they call these educated, sophisticated readers. I kind of object to that word choice. I'm not sure what they mean, really. What does it mean to be educated? High school, college, grad school? I don't like having rules about who's eligible to be part of the audience, or who's eligible to have an interpretation. I don't think we should talk a lot about are you educated enough, and certainly not are you sophisticated enough. If we're going by sophistication, I think I'm disqualified. I don't even know what it means to be a sophisticated reader. I guess that just means you read a lot, you know what you're doing. But I don't like the language. I don't like saying you have to be educated and sophisticated in order to interpret literature, or that we can confine the possible meanings to what educated, sophisticated people might think. I would just say if you're reading and you're working hard and you're working honestly, you're eligible. I don't care what your level of education is. I don't care what your level of sophistication is. If you're doing the right kind of analysis, if you're looking for the right kind of stuff, your interpretation is valid. Most likely, your interpretation will fall within that reasonable range of acceptable interpretation. So I'm going to differ with the book a little bit and say throw out educated and sophisticated. It's just about doing the work. If you're willing to do the work, you're going to be fine. And you might even become one of those imagined readers that these authors are thinking about when they're working. So we can definitely be empowered to think more about readers, but let's also think more about staying in the text. Okay, so I want to spend 2 weeks on formalism. I think we should do more practice next week. So if you have questions, let me know. But we're going to stick with formalism next week, and we're really going to focus more on the examples of formalist analysis with the text that we have read. So take a look on page 96 for a formalist analysis of To His Coy Mistress, and then look at page 116 for a formalist approach to Frankenstein. I want to talk about both of those next week. So I will see you then.